I'd like to begin today by lighting our chalice. With the kindling of this flame, we reaffirm our commitment to accept life's gifts with grace and gratitude, and to use them to bless the world in the spirit of love. This past week, a friend forwarded to me a recently published National Public Radio article. The article was a result of a poetry challenge NPR issued early last month in April of 2020. The challenge was to submit some poetry which describes how you have been affected by the global coronavirus pandemic. And the submissions, the first line of the poem should begin with this line: "What I'm learning about grief." So after all the submissions were received, NPR's poet-in-residence, Kwame Alexander, compiled lines from the myriad poems to create one crowdsourced communal poem. The communal poem combined submissions from 33 different poets from all over the country, one from overseas, women and men, and one 13-year-old young person. I found the poem very moving myself. I didn't know you could take such creative license like that to cut and paste other people's poems to create a large one. But I encourage you to read it for yourself. I will not recite the poem in its entirety. It's quite long, but I do want to read a few stanzas and riff off them briefly to hopefully unlock some of the wisdom within. What I'm learning about grief is that it is a language. Suffering is its own speech. It will not go away just because you won't look it in the eye. What I'm learning about grief is that it's an old lover that won't leave, trying to hold your hand again. That it aches in the arches of feet. That its mother is loss, its father change. Make room for it. Now, when I use the term grief, I use it with two separate meanings. I use grief to describe a feeling. I'm feeling grief, a kind of profound, full-bodied sadness. Then there's also grief, perhaps grief with a capital G, which is the grief process, as in the emotional, behavioral, physiological, social process of regaining equilibrium after loss or change. The grief process can include sadness and any other emotion. And the grief process is what these two stanzas are referring to. Now, for many of us, when we feel grief welling up inside us, our knee-jerk response is to avoid, 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 shut it down, power through, numb it away. Why do we do this? I think we do this because we are afraid. Afraid of perhaps overwhelming feelings of sadness. Afraid to acknowledge the reality of loss. We do this because we harbor false beliefs. We are tough. We can power through. Grieving is a weakness. Or the false belief of, I already grieved this last month, so I don't have to grieve anymore. Mostly, I think we do this because we never learned how to grieve. If our role models growing up would avoid, and power through and shut down or numb out to grief in their life, chances are pretty good that is what we will do as well. Grief is a skill, and it's a skill we can learn. It requires a softness in the heart. It requires us to make room for it. We must learn the language and contours of grief. We must look it in the eye when it comes to visit. Great benefits come to us when we welcome grief, when we learn that skill. We can roll with the punches of life, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. We can acknowledge loss and failure and continue the dance. Great detriment comes to us when we continually avoid or power through or numb out grief. It just adds up and up and up. Then when we let just one little grief in, all the ungrieved losses from years past come bursting in. It's true, I've seen this happen. It can be quite overwhelming. Learning to respond to grief with skill requires humility. Why? Because grief has its own timeline, a timeline that doesn't conform to our wished for appropriate amount of grieving timeline. Grief comes and goes. It isn't linear. It can't be neatly compartmentalized. It can spring up years and years after a loss. This has happened to many of us recently. Old hurts and pains have sprung up during this past 6 weeks of stay-in-place orders during the global pandemic. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has a saying attributed to him: "When we are tired, we are attacked by ideas we conquered long ago." A corollary in the recovery community in 12-step, a well-known self-care tool is known as HALT. This is an acronym that stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. When we are in one of these states, there is a danger for relapse to unhealthy or addictive behaviors. And so doing the work is to be present and aware of your current state and healthy behaviors to engage, to respond to them, such as when we're hungry, eat, or when we're tired, rest. The final 2 stanzas of the communal poem end on a high note. What I'm learning about grief is to acknowledge its presence, its many forms and guises, then to use it while reaching out, connected to everyone who is braving the same storm. What I'm learning about grief is that it is still learning about me, learning that I am strong and resilient. If the trees can keep dancing, so can I. This current predicament we're in, we can use our suffering to experience solidarity with each other, connected to everyone who is braving the same storm. And the communal poem ends with a hopeful tone, using the natural world as our role model for strength and resilience. How a tree in the wind bends but doesn't break. If the trees can keep dancing, so can I. Any poem with trees and dancing metaphors, I will probably enjoy. And so may you keep on dancing. And may you go in peace.